The 6-year-old daughter of tech billionaire David Harrington hadn't eaten solid food in 23 days, and her father was watching her slowly disappear before his eyes. The newest cleaning lady had just walked into the pristine white kitchen of their Beverly Hills mansion, carrying a bowl of fresh strawberries, completely unaware that she was about to save a little girl's life. Comment your city below and hit subscribe to join our global community. Enjoy the story. 3 weeks earlier, Sophie Harrington had stopped eating. Not the typical 6-year-old pickiness that most parents navigated with patience and creativity, but a complete, devastating refusal to consume anything except small sips of water. The pediatricians had no medical explanation. The child psychologists offered theories about delayed grief reaction to her mother's death 6 months prior. David Harrington, who could solve complex technological problems worth millions in revenue, stood helpless as his daughter withered away, despite the best medical care money could buy. That August morning, Helen Richardson stepped through the service entrance of the Harrington estate for her first day of work. At 29, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that honest work deserved respect, regardless of the size of the paycheck. Her auburn hair was pulled back practically, her clothes simple but clean, and her green eyes held the kind of warmth that drew people toward her, without her ever trying to command attention. "You must be Helen," said Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper, leading her through corridors that gleamed with expensive marble and original artwork. "Mr. Harrington specifically requested someone who was good with children. His daughter has been going through a difficult time." Helen nodded, though Mrs. Morrison's carefully chosen words couldn't quite hide the worry in her voice. As they passed the main staircase, Helen caught a glimpse of a small figure in pink pajamas sitting at the top of the stairs, watching the activity below with enormous dark eyes that seemed too old for such a young face. "That's Miss Sophie," Mrs. Morrison whispered. "Poor little thing hasn't been herself since her mother passed." Mr. Harrington is beside himself with worry. David Harrington emerged from his home office as they reached the kitchen, and Helen's breath caught slightly. At 38, he carried the controlled intensity of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his white shirt crisp, even though it was clear he'd been up most of the night. But it was his eyes that struck her most, the deep exhaustion of a parent who was fighting a battle he didn't know how to win. "Ms. Richardson," he said, extending his hand with the kind of automatic courtesy that came from years of high-level business meetings. "Thank you for coming. I know this position is somewhat unconventional." Helen shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way his attention seemed divided, as if part of him was always listening for sounds from upstairs. "I understand you need someone who can help with household management and spend time with Sophie. I'm happy to do whatever would be most helpful." "The truth is," David said, running a hand through his hair, "Sophie has been struggling since her mother died. She stopped eating and nothing we try seems to help. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong, but—" He trailed off, the helplessness evident in his voice. Before Helen could respond, a small voice spoke from the doorway. "Daddy, who is that lady?" Sophie Harrington stood clutching a stuffed elephant, her blonde hair tangled from sleep, her thin frame lost in pajamas that seemed too big for her tiny body. Helen's heart clenched at the sight of this beautiful child who looked so fragile, so lost. "This is Helen," David said gently, crouching down to Sophie's level. "She's going to help take care of our house and maybe spend some time with you if you'd like that." Sophie studied Helen with those serious dark eyes, taking in every detail. Children had always been drawn to Helen's natural warmth, and she could see something in Sophie's gaze that suggested the little girl was testing, evaluating, deciding whether this new person could be trusted. "I like your hair," Sophie said finally, the first words she'd spoken that morning according to the worried look David exchanged with Mrs. Morrison. "Thank you," Helen said, crouching down so they were at eye level. "I like your elephant. Does he have a name?" "Mr. Peanuts. Mama gave him to me." Sophie's voice became smaller when she mentioned her mother, and Helen saw David's jaw tighten with suppressed emotion. "Mr. Peanuts looks like he gives very good hugs," Helen said seriously. "I bet he takes good care of you." Sophie nodded, and for a moment, something almost like a smile flickered across her face before disappearing again. The rest of the morning passed quietly, as Helen learned the routines of the vast house. David disappeared into his office for a succession of phone calls with his company's international offices, but she could feel his awareness of Sophie's movements, the way he tensed whenever his daughter was out of his sight for too long. Around noon, Helen was organizing the pantry when she discovered a basket of fresh strawberries that the grocery service had delivered that morning. On impulse, she washed them carefully and arranged them in a beautiful crystal bowl, making them look as appealing as possible. She'd grown up in a house where presentation mattered, where making something beautiful was its own kind of love. She found Sophie in the living room, curled up on an enormous leather sofa that dwarfed her small frame, staring listlessly at a cartoon that played on the massive television screen. The child's lack of interest in the colorful animation was heartbreaking, as if she'd lost the ability to find joy in anything. "Sophie," Helen said softly, sitting down beside her with the bowl of strawberries, "I thought you might like to try some of these. They're very sweet." "I'm not hungry," Sophie said automatically, the response she'd given to everyone for weeks. "That's okay," Helen said, selecting a particularly beautiful strawberry. "But sometimes our bodies need food, even when we don't feel hungry. Like how we need sleep, even when we don't feel tired." She bit into the strawberry, making a small sound of appreciation. This one tastes like summer, like sunshine and sweet dreams." Despite herself, Sophie glanced over, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Helen selected another strawberry, examining it thoughtfully. "You know, I think strawberries are magic," Helen said conversationally. "My grandmother told me that when you eat a strawberry, you're eating a little piece of happiness that the plant saved up all year long." "Really?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, but it held the first note of interest Helen had heard from her. "Really? Want to see if your strawberry tastes like happiness?" For a long moment, Sophie stared at the bowl. Then, so slowly that Helen held her breath, the little girl reached out and selected the smallest strawberry in the bowl. She examined it carefully, as if weighing the risk of hoping again. David appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of conversation, and froze when he saw what was happening. Helen caught his movement in her peripheral vision, but didn't turn, knowing that too much attention might break whatever fragile moment was building. Sophie brought the strawberry to her lips, hesitated, then took the smallest possible bite. Helen watched as the 6-year-old's face changed, as if she was remembering what taste was, what sweetness could be. "It does taste like happiness," Sophie whispered, wonder creeping into her voice. "I told you," Helen said softly. "Magic." Sophie ate the entire strawberry, then reached for another, and another. David stood frozen in the doorway, tears he didn't know he'd been holding back finally spilling down his cheeks, as he watched his daughter eat solid food for the first time in nearly a month. But what he didn't know was that this moment of hope would soon collide with forces beyond his control, and the woman who just saved his daughter would face a choice that would test everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the price of building a life with someone whose past held secrets that could destroy them both. Helen Richardson had always believed that the hardest jobs were often the most rewarding, but as she stood in the marble-floored foyer of the Harrington estate that first morning, she wondered if she'd finally found a challenge that might be beyond her abilities. The mansion's perfection felt cold, sterile, as if happiness had been carefully cleaned away along with any trace of mess or imperfection. Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper, guided her through rooms that belonged in architectural magazines, rather than a home where a 6-year-old should be running around, leaving the comfortable chaos that children naturally created. Every surface gleamed, every piece of furniture sat at precise angles, and the silence felt heavy with unspoken grief. "Mr. Harrington is very particular about maintaining his late wife's standards," Mrs. Morrison explained, as they passed a sitting room dominated by a portrait of a stunning blonde woman, with Sophie's eyes and a smile that suggested she'd brought warmth to these pristine spaces. Mrs. Victoria was quite the perfectionist, but she had a gift for making this place feel like a home. Helen studied the portrait, noting the way Victoria Harrington's hand rested protectively on the shoulder of a younger Sophie, both of them radiating the kind of joy that came from complete security in being loved. No wonder the child was lost without her mother's presence. "The accident was sudden," Mrs. Morrison continued quietly. "Car crash on the Pacific Coast Highway during a storm. Mr. Harrington hasn't been the same since, and little Sophie just stopped being a child overnight." They continued through the house, Helen memorizing layouts and routines while absorbing the weight of the family's loss. David Harrington's home office was a shrine to controlled productivity, multiple monitors displaying stock prices and business analytics, phones and tablets arranged with military precision. Through the glass walls, Helen could see him pacing while speaking rapidly into a wireless headset, his movements suggesting barely contained energy and frustration. "He works too much now," Mrs. Morrison observed. 16-hour days most days, trying to lose himself in business. But every time Miss Sophie refuses another meal, you can see a piece of him break. That's when Helen heard it, a soft sound that didn't belong in the house's expensive quiet. Following the sound, she discovered Sophie in what had clearly once been a playroom, but now felt more like a museum of childhood. Toys sat arranged on shelves, untouched and gathering dust. Art supplies remained organized in containers that hadn't been opened in months. And in the center of it all, Sophie sat on the floor, humming tunelessly to herself, while Mr. Peanuts sat in her lap. The little girl looked up when Helen entered, and for a moment hope flickered in her dark eyes before disappearing behind the walls she'd learned to build. "Hi," Helen said simply, settling cross-legged on the floor a respectful distance away. "Is it okay if I sit with you for a minute?" Sophie nodded, though she didn't speak. Helen looked around the perfect playroom, noting the expensive educational toys, the art station that clearly cost more than Helen's car, the reading nook filled with beautifully illustrated children's books. "You know," Helen said conversationally, "when I was little, my favorite place wasn't my bedroom or the living room. It was the kitchen floor. My mum would give me pots and wooden spoons, and I'd make music while she cooked dinner." "Daddy doesn't cook," Sophie said quietly. "Maria makes our food now, but I don't like eating anymore." The simple statement carried such heartbreak that Helen felt tears threaten. She blinked them back, knowing that sympathy wasn't what this child needed. What she needed was someone who could meet her in the darkness and gently guide her back toward the light. "Sometimes when we're very sad, eating feels like too much work," Helen said, "like our bodies forget how to want things that used to make us happy." Sophie looked at her with surprise, as if no adult had ever acknowledged that her feelings made sense, rather than trying to logic her out of them. "But you know what I've learned?" Helen continued. "Sometimes we have to remind our bodies how to be happy again, one tiny step at a time." That afternoon, Helen convinced Sophie to help her explore the mansion's massive kitchen, which was equipped like a restaurant but felt as sterile as an operating room. Sophie's job was to be the official taste tester, while Helen prepared what she called adventure snacks, tiny portions of different flavors and textures designed to make eating feel like play rather than obligation. David found them there an hour later, Sophie perched on a bar stool, while Helen arranged microscopic portions of cheese, crackers, and fruit on a plate that looked like a tiny rainbow. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he watched Sophie actually pick up a piece of cheese and examine it with scientific curiosity. "Miss Helen says food can be art," Sophie explained solemnly, "and art is supposed to make you feel things." David's eyes met Helen's over his daughter's head, and the gratitude in his gaze was so intense that Helen felt her cheeks warm. She'd worked for wealthy families before, but there was something about David Harrington's quiet desperation, his obvious devotion to his daughter, that touched something deep in her chest. "Would you like to try some?" "Daddy?" Sophie asked, offering him a tiny cube of mild cheddar. For a moment, David looked as though she'd offered him the most precious gift in the world. "I would love to," he said, accepting the cheese with the gravity of a sacred ritual. As Helen watched father and daughter share their first meal together in weeks, she didn't notice David's phone buzzing insistently on the counter, displaying a message that would soon force her to discover that the man whose daughter she was learning to love carried secrets that could put them all in danger. 3 days later, Helen began to understand the rhythm of the Harrington household, and more importantly, the rhythm of David's carefully controlled life. He was awake by 5:30 every morning, spending an hour in the home gym before showering and dressing in the kind of perfectly tailored suits that cost more than Helen's monthly salary. By 7, he was in his office, already deep in conversations with business associates in Tokyo and London. But every hour on the hour, he would emerge to check on Sophie, his expression shifting from corporate intensity to tender concern in the space of a heartbeat. Sophie had begun eating small amounts regularly, but only when Helen prepared the food, and only when they turned meals into games or adventures. This morning they were having teddy bear breakfast, where Mr. Peanuts got to choose what Sophie would eat by pointing his trunk toward different options. It was silly and time-consuming, but watching Sophie's face light up with something approaching joy made every moment worthwhile. "Mr. Peanuts wants the blueberry pancakes," Sophie announced, making the stuffed elephant nod enthusiastically, but only the ones that looked like flowers. Helen had discovered that Sophie would eat almost anything if it was arranged to look like something other than food. Pancakes became flowers, strawberries became hearts, and cheese cubes became tiny golden treasures. It required patience and creativity, but Helen had both in abundance. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work but moving more slowly than usual, as if he was reluctant to leave this scene of domestic normalcy. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of Sophie's head. "How is Mr. Peanuts this morning?" "He's very hungry today," Sophie said seriously. "Miss Helen says elephants eat lots of flowers in the wild, so we're having flower pancakes." "That sounds perfect," David said, his eyes meeting Helen's with that same grateful warmth that made her pulse skip. "I have to leave for a few meetings today, but I'll be back by dinner time. Promise?" Sophie asked, and Helen heard the anxiety that still threaded through everything the little girl said. 6 months after losing her mother, Sophie clearly lived in constant fear that her father might disappear too. "I promise," David said firmly. "And tonight maybe Miss Helen could teach us how to make those adventure snacks for movie night." Sophie's smile was like sunrise, bright and unexpected and absolutely beautiful. "Can we watch the elephant movie? The one with the flying elephant?" "We can watch whatever you want," David assured her. And Helen saw the way he treasured every sign of his daughter's returning spirit. After David left for work, Helen and Sophie spent the morning in the garden behind the house, which Victoria had designed with a child in mind. There were hidden pathways, a small gazebo perfect for tea parties, and raised beds that had once been filled with herbs and flowers, but now sat neglected and overgrown. "Mama used to grow strawberries here," Sophie said, kneeling beside a bed that was now filled with weeds. "She said gardens need love to grow. Would you like to help me bring your mama's garden back?" Helen asked gently. "We could plant new flowers, and maybe some vegetables too." Sophie considered this seriously. "Would Mama like that?" "I think your Mama would love knowing that her garden was making you happy again," Helen said. "Love doesn't stop just because someone can't be with us anymore." They spent the afternoon planning their garden restoration, Sophie's excitement building, as they discussed which flowers would attract butterflies and which vegetables would be fun to harvest. For the first time since Helen had arrived, Sophie seemed like a normal 6-year-old, full of questions and ideas and boundless enthusiasm. It was while they were inside researching child-friendly plants on Helen's tablet that the first sign of trouble appeared. A black sedan pulled up to the front gate, and Helen watched through the window as 2 men in expensive suits got out and approached the intercom. They weren't dressed like delivery drivers or service technicians, and something about their posture suggested they weren't here for a friendly social call. "Miss Helen, who are those men?" Sophie asked, noticing Helen's sudden tension. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," Helen said, instinctively moving between Sophie and the window. "Why don't we go up to your room and read a story while we wait for your daddy to come home?" But even as she guided Sophie upstairs, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the men at the gate represented something that could shatter the fragile peace they'd been building. She'd seen enough of the world to recognize danger when it appeared, and everything about those visitors suggested that David Harrington's life contained complications he'd never mentioned. An hour later, David's voice echoed through the house as he returned home earlier than expected, his tone carrying an urgency that made Helen's stomach tighten with worry. "Helen? Sophie? Where are you?" They found him in his office, still wearing his suit but with his tie loosened, and his usual composure somewhat shaken. His face brightened when he saw Sophie, but Helen noticed the way his eyes continued to dart toward his phone, which had been buzzing constantly since his arrival. "How was your day, Princess?" he asked Sophie, pulling her onto his lap with an intensity that suggested he needed the comfort of holding her as much as she needed to be held. "Miss Helen and I are going to plant a garden like Mama's," Sophie announced, "with strawberries and flowers that butterflies like." "That sounds wonderful," David said, but Helen could hear the distraction in his voice, see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Daddy, are you sad?" Sophie asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "Just thinking about grown-up things," David said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Nothing for you to worry about." But as Helen watched them together, she realized she was seeing only a fraction of David Harrington's reality. The man who read bedtime stories and worried about his daughter's eating habits clearly inhabited a world far more complex than the one she'd been shown, and she was beginning to understand that falling for him might mean accepting mysteries that could put all of them at risk. Helen had been working for the Harrington family for 2 weeks when she realized she was falling in love with both of them, father and daughter, in completely different but equally dangerous ways. Sophie had begun to bloom under consistent care and gentle encouragement, eating regular meals, laughing at Helen's silly songs, and even asking to help with simple cooking projects. But it was David who presented the more complex challenge to Helen's carefully guarded heart. He was nothing like the wealthy men she'd encountered in previous positions. There was no arrogance, no assumption that money entitled him to treat staff as invisible. Instead, he asked about her day, remembered details about her life, and treated her opinions about Sophie's care with genuine respect. When he came home from work, he didn't disappear into his office or escape into business calls. He sat on the floor to play with Sophie, listened to every detail of their daily adventures, and made it clear that being her father was the most important job he had. But Helen was beginning to notice things that didn't quite fit the image of a simple tech company CEO. The phone calls that made his expression harden with tension, the way he sometimes stood at the windows, watching the street with an alertness that seemed almost military, the expensive security system that monitored not just the house but the surrounding property with cameras that seemed more sophisticated than typical home protection. This particular Thursday morning, Helen arrived to find David in the kitchen before dawn, wearing jeans and a black t-shirt that revealed the lean muscles of someone who took physical fitness seriously. He was making coffee with the focused intensity he brought to everything, but when he looked up and saw her, his smile was warm enough to make her pulse quicken. "You're early," he said, glancing at the clock. "I didn't expect you for another hour." "I wanted to get started on Sophie's breakfast," Helen said, trying to ignore how good he looked in casual clothes, how the absence of a business suit made him seem more approachable, more human. "She's been asking for rainbow eggs every morning this week." David laughed, and the sound sent warmth through Helen's chest. "I still can't believe you figured out how to make scrambled eggs look like a rainbow. She ate more yesterday than she did in the entire month before you arrived." "She just needed someone to remember that eating should be fun," Helen said, beginning to gather ingredients from the refrigerator. "Children respond to creativity and attention. So do adults," David said quietly, and when Helen looked up, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Before she could respond, Sophie's voice called from upstairs, breaking the moment, but not the sudden awareness that hummed between them. "Daddy, Miss Helen, I'm awake." "Our princess has risen," David said with a grin, but Helen noticed the way he continued to watch her as she moved around the kitchen, preparing for another day of the domestic routine that was becoming precious to all of them. Sophie appeared in her pajamas, hair wild from sleep, clutching Mr. Peanuts and already chattering about the garden they were planning to start that afternoon. David scooped her up for their morning hug, and Helen felt her heart contract at the sight of them together. This beautiful man and his beloved daughter, who had both become so important to her. "Miss Helen, can we plant the sunflower seeds today?" Sophie asked, climbing into her chair at the kitchen island. "I want them to grow tall enough to touch the clouds." "Sunflowers can grow very tall," Helen said, beginning the process of turning ordinary scrambled eggs into the rainbow creation that had become Sophie's favorite breakfast. "But they need lots of sunshine and patience." "I have patience," Sophie announced seriously. "Daddy says patience is a superpower." "Your daddy is very smart," Helen said, adding drops of natural food coloring to different portions of eggs, creating the reds, yellows, and blues that would make Sophie's breakfast magical. David watched this process with the fascination of someone seeing a master at work. "How do you come up with these ideas?" he asked. "My grandmother," Helen said, carefully layering the colored eggs to create rainbow stripes. "She raised me after my parents died, and she believed that every meal should be a celebration. Even when we had very little, she found ways to make food beautiful and special." "She sounds like a wonderful woman," David said softly. "She was," Helen agreed, trying not to let the old grief show in her voice. She would have loved Sophie. She always said children were flowers that needed both sunshine and rain to grow properly. Sophie considered this seriously while examining her rainbow eggs. "Miss Helen, do you think my mama can see our garden from heaven?" The question hung in the air, and Helen saw David freeze, clearly struggling with how to answer. She looked at this beautiful, vulnerable child and felt her heart break with protective love. "I think love is stronger than distance," Helen said gently. "So yes, I think your mama can see everything that makes you happy. And I think she's proud of what a brave, Smart, kind little girl you're growing up to be. Sophie smiled, satisfied with this answer, and dug into her breakfast with enthusiasm. But Helen noticed David watching her with an expression of gratitude so intense it made her cheeks warm. Later, when Sophie was upstairs getting dressed, he approached her at the sink where she was washing dishes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for knowing exactly what to say, for making her feel safe enough to ask difficult questions." "She's an amazing little girl," Helen said, very aware of how close he was standing, how she could smell his cologne and see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. She just needed someone to listen to her fears instead of trying to fix them. "So did I," David said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. Helen turned to look at him, and for a moment the air between them felt electric with possibility. She could see interest in his eyes, attraction that matched her own, but also something that looked like warning. Before either of them could say anything more, the sound of Sophie's footsteps on the stairs broke the spell. David stepped back, running a hand through his hair, and Helen busied herself with putting dishes away, both of them trying to pretend that something significant hadn't almost happened. But that evening, after Sophie was in bed and Helen was preparing to leave for the day, David stopped her at the front door. "Helen," he said, and something in his tone made her turn back to face him. "There are things about my life, about my business, that are complicated. I need you to know that before—" "Before what?" she asked when he trailed off. "Before I do something stupid like tell you how much I look forward to coming home because you're here," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Before I admit that watching you with Sophie makes me want things I haven't wanted since Victoria died." Helen felt her heart racing, but she also heard the warning beneath his words. "What kind of complicated?" David was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth he could share. "The kind that could put people I care about at risk if they get too close to me." "And if I'm willing to accept that risk?" Helen asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Then I'd say you don't fully understand what you'd be accepting," David said. "But I'd also say that I'm finding it harder every day to remember why I should keep my distance." That night, Helen lay awake thinking about David's warning and her own response to it. She was falling for a man who clearly carried secrets, possibly dangerous ones. The smart thing would be to maintain professional boundaries, to protect herself and Sophie from whatever complications David couldn't fully explain. But as she thought about the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel both cherished and challenged, Helen realized that the smart thing might not be the right thing. Sometimes the most important decisions required choosing love over safety, hope over fear, and tomorrow she would have to decide exactly how brave she was willing to be. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Friday evening when Helen stayed late to help Sophie with a school project about family trees. Sophie had become increasingly frustrated trying to explain the empty spaces where her mother's information should have gone, and Helen found herself holding a quietly sobbing 6-year-old who just wanted her mama back. "It's not fair," Sophie whispered against Helen's shoulder. "Everyone else has a mama to help them with homework." "You're right," Helen said softly, rubbing soothing circles on Sophie's back. "It's not fair at all. Sometimes life takes away people we love before we're ready to say goodbye." David found them there, Helen sitting on Sophie's bedroom floor with his daughter curled in her lap, both of them surrounded by art supplies and family photos that told the story of a life interrupted. His expression as he took in the scene was so raw, so full of his own grief and gratitude, that Helen felt tears begin to burn behind her eyes. "What's wrong, Princess?" he asked, settling on the floor beside them with the casual grace that had become so familiar to Helen. "I can't do my family tree," Sophie said, lifting her tear-stained face from Helen's shoulder. "Mrs. Patterson says we need to put our parents' names and where they were born, but I don't know anything about Mama's family, because they all died before I was born." Helen saw David's jaw tighten with suppressed emotion. Victoria had been an orphan, raised in foster care, which was part of what had drawn them together initially. They'd both understood what it felt like to build a family from nothing, to create the stability they'd never had as children. "You know what?" Helen said, inspiration striking. "What if we made a different kind of family tree? One that shows all the people who love Sophie, not just the ones who share her DNA." Sophie pulled back to look at her with interest. "Like who?" "Like your daddy who reads you stories every night. Like Mrs. Morrison who always saves the biggest cookies for you. Like Maria who makes your favorite pancakes shaped like elephants." Helen reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Family isn't just about who gave birth to you. It's about who chooses to love you every single day. As they worked together to create Sophie's alternative family tree, Helen became aware of David watching her, with an intensity that made her skin feel warm. When Sophie finally fell asleep an hour later, exhausted by the emotional evening, David helped Helen clean up the art supplies in comfortable silence. "Thank you," he said finally, as they stood in his daughter's doorway watching her sleep peacefully, "for knowing exactly what she needed to hear, for helping her understand that love comes in many different forms. She's lucky to have a father who loves her so completely," Helen said softly. "Not every child gets that." "She's lucky to have you too," David said, his voice rough with emotion. "These past few weeks watching her come back to life, Helen, you've given me my daughter back." They moved into the hallway and Helen started to gather her things, but David's hand on her arm stopped her. "Stay," he said quietly. "Please. Sophie's asleep. The house is quiet and I realize I never get to talk to you alone. Just us without work or schedules or the constant awareness that we're being overheard." Helen knew she should leave, should maintain the professional boundaries that were already blurring dangerously, but the vulnerability in David's voice, the way he looked at her as though she was something precious he was afraid to lose, made the decision for her. "I could stay for a little while," she said. David led her to the living room where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city lights stretching toward the ocean. He poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle that probably cost more than Helen's weekly salary, but his hands shook slightly as he handed her the glass, betraying nerves that made him seem more human, more accessible. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said, settling beside her on the leather sofa that was big enough to seat 6 people, but somehow felt intimate with just the 2 of them. For the next hour, Helen found herself sharing stories she rarely told anyone, memories of the woman who had shaped her understanding of love and resilience. David listened with the complete attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, asking questions that showed he was building a detailed picture of her life, her values, her dreams. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," he said when Helen finished describing her grandmother's last years. "Spent teaching neighborhood children to cook while battling the cancer that would eventually claim her life." "She was," Helen said, surprised by how easy it had been to share these memories with him. "She taught me that taking care of people is a privilege, not a burden. That love is something you do, not just something you feel. Is that why you're so good with Sophie? Because you understand that love requires action?" Helen studied his face in the soft lamplight, noting the way exhaustion and hope warred in his expression. "Why are you asking me these questions, David?" He was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass as if the answer could be found in the movement of the liquid. "Because I'm falling in love with you," he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost missed the words. "Because watching you with my daughter, seeing the way you've brought joy back into this house has made me feel things I thought died with Victoria." Helen's heart stopped, then began racing so fast she was sure he could hear it. "David, I know it's complicated," he continued, setting down his glass and turning to face her fully. "I know there are reasons this is a terrible idea, but Helena, I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just gratitude or professional appreciation." Before Helen could respond, his phone rang, the sound harsh and intrusive in the intimate atmosphere they'd created. David glanced at the caller ID and his expression immediately hardened. "I have to take this," he said, his voice shifting into the controlled tone she'd heard him use during business calls. "Marcus, this better be important." Helen couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched David's face grow increasingly grim as he listened. When he finally hung up, the vulnerability that had been in his eyes moments before was completely gone, replaced by a hardness that made him look like a stranger. "Helen," he said carefully, "I need to ask you to trust me even though I can't explain everything right now. There are people who might try to use you or Sophie to get to me. I need you to promise me that if anyone approaches you, anyone at all asking questions about our family, you'll tell me immediately." The romantic spell of the evening shattered as Helen realized that David's earlier warnings about complications hadn't been vague concerns about mixing business with personal feelings. They'd been warnings about real danger. "What kind of people?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "The kind who don't care about innocent people getting caught in the crossfire," David said grimly. "Helen, I'm going to have to increase security around the house. There will be additional staff. New protocols. I need you to follow them without question." "You're scaring me," Helen said honestly. "Good," David replied, though his expression was anything but satisfied. "Fear will keep you and Sophie safe. Trust will keep us together. I'm asking for both." As Helen drove home that night, she realized that her choice had been made the moment David admitted he was falling in love with her. Because despite the danger, despite the unanswered questions, despite every logical reason to walk away, she was falling in love with him too. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether that love was strong enough to face whatever storm was coming their way. The storm arrived 3 days later, in the form of a woman who looked like she'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. Helen was in the garden with Sophie, teaching her how to plant the strawberry seedlings they'd chosen together, when the black luxury sedan pulled up to the front gate. "Miss Helen, who is that pretty lady?" Sophie asked, pausing in her careful arrangement of tiny plants to watch the visitor approach the house. Helen shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, studying the woman who moved toward them with predatory grace. Everything about her screamed money and power, from her designer heels that should have been impractical for walking on gravel to the pearl jewelry that probably cost more than Helen's car. But it was the calculating way the woman's gaze fixed on Sophie that made Helen's protective instincts flare to life. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," Helen said, instinctively moving closer to Sophie. "Why don't we go inside and wash the dirt off our hands?" But the woman was already too close, her smile perfectly calibrated to appear friendly, while her eyes remained cold as winter. "You must be little Sophie," she said, crouching down with practiced ease despite her expensive dress. "I'm Elena Castellanos. I was a very dear friend of your father's before he met your mother." Sophie looked up at Helen uncertainly, clearly sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air despite the woman's seemingly pleasant demeanor. "Sophie," Helen said carefully, "why don't you take Mr. Peanuts inside and ask Mrs. Morrison for a snack? I'll be right behind you." "But we weren't finished planting," Sophie protested. "The strawberries will wait," Helen assured her, using the gentle but firm tone that Sophie had learned meant the discussion was over. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Elena Castellanos watched this exchange with interest, her smile never wavering but her eyes growing sharper as Sophie reluctantly headed toward the house. "You're the new nanny," Elena said once they were alone, rising gracefully and studying Helen with undisguised assessment. "How interesting. David always did have a weakness for taking in strays." "I'm sorry, but Mr. Harrington didn't mention he was expecting visitors," Helen said, maintaining her polite tone despite the insult. "Perhaps you could call and make an appointment." "Oh, David and I are old friends," Elena said with a laugh that sounded like crystal breaking. "We don't need formal appointments. In fact, I was hoping to surprise him. Tell me, how long have you been working here?" Something about the woman's questions felt like an interrogation disguised as casual conversation. Helen had grown up in neighborhoods where people learned to recognize danger in all its forms, and every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings. "I should really check on Sophie," Helen said, starting to move toward the house. "Of course," Eleanor agreed, but she fell into step beside Helen, clearly not intending to be dismissed. "She's a beautiful child, so much like her mother. Victoria was quite lovely, you know, though perhaps not as practical as she should have been." The casual cruelty in Eleanor's voice when she mentioned Victoria made Helen's stomach clench with anger, but before she could respond, David's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Eleanor." He stood in the doorway of the house, and Helen had never seen him look so coldly furious. Gone was the warm, gentle man who read bedtime stories and worried about his daughter's eating habits. This version of David Harrington radiated controlled danger in a way that made Elena's calculated confidence falter slightly. "David," Elena replied, recovering quickly and moving toward him with the confidence of someone who believed she still held cards worth playing. "You look wonderful. Success suits you. What do you want?" David asked, his tone containing not a trace of warmth or welcome. "Can't an old friend stop by to see how you're doing?" Elena asked. But Helen noticed the way her eyes darted around, taking in details of the property, the security measures, the general layout of David's life. "We were never friends, Elena," David said flatly, "and you have exactly 30 seconds to explain why you're on my property before I have security escort you off it." "I'm hurt," Elena said with mock sadness. "After everything we meant to each other. Though I have to say, your choice in household staff is interesting. Does she know about your past, David? About the family business she's gotten herself mixed up in?" Helen felt ice form in her stomach, as Elena's words confirmed what she'd begun to suspect about the complexities David had warned her about. But before she could process the full implications, David stepped forward with a movement so fluid and controlled that it was almost predatory. "Helen," he said without taking his eyes off Elena, "please go inside and make sure Sophie stays there until I come for you." "David?" Helen started, but the look he gave her was so intense, so protective and commanding at the same time, that she found herself nodding and moving toward the house. As she reached the doorway, she heard Elena's parting shot, delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to aim for maximum damage. "Ask him about Chicago, dear," Elena called after her. "Ask him about the family business that makes all this luxury possible. Ask him why women who get too close to the Harrington men have such a tendency to meet tragic ends." Helen made it inside before her legs gave out, sinking onto a hallway chair as the implications of Elena's words crashed over her. Family business. Chicago. The suggestion that Victoria's death hadn't been the random accident David had portrayed. Through the window, she could see David and Elena locked in what appeared to be a heated argument, their body language suggesting a history filled with anger and betrayal. Whatever Elena wanted, whatever game she was playing, it was clear that David's life contained layers of danger that made his earlier warnings seem almost quaint. 20 minutes later, Eleanor's sedan disappeared down the driveway, and David entered the house looking like a man who'd just fought a war. His usual composure was completely gone, replaced by exhaustion and something that looked like fear. "Where's Sophie?" he asked immediately. "Upstairs with Mrs. Morrison, having a tea party with Mr. Peanuts," Helen said, standing on unsteady legs. "David, what did she mean about—" "Not here," David said quickly, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. "After Sophie's in bed tonight. We'll talk then and I'll explain everything I can." "Everything?" Helen asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for complete honesty. "Enough," David said, meeting her eyes with an expression that held both regret and determination. "Enough for you to make an informed decision about whether you want to stay in our lives or run as fast as you can in the opposite direction." That night, Helen sat in her small apartment staring at the business card Elena had pressed into her hand before leaving. A card that contained nothing but a phone number and the words, "When you're ready for the truth." Part of her wanted to make that call, to get Elena's version of David's story before hearing his carefully edited explanation. But as she thought about Sophie's laughter in the garden, about David's gentle hands as he tucked his daughter into bed, about the way he'd looked at her when he admitted he was falling in love, Helen realized that some truths were worth fighting for, even when they came wrapped in danger. Tomorrow, she would hear David's story, and then she would have to decide whether love was stronger than fear, whether the family they were building was worth the risks that came with David Harrington's complicated past. David poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey before beginning the conversation that would either destroy everything they were building or forge it into something unbreakable. Helen sat across from him in his home office, the same room where she'd watched him conduct countless business calls, but tonight it felt like a confessional where secrets came to die. "My grandfather started the family business in Chicago during Prohibition," David began, his voice steady but his knuckles white where they gripped the glass. "Import and export, he called it. Very profitable, very dangerous, and very illegal." Helen felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to remain silent, to let him tell this story in his own way. "By the time I was born, the Harrington family had legitimate businesses mixed in with the less legitimate ones. Construction, real estate development, a few restaurants. My father tried to go completely legal, but it's harder to leave that world than people understand. There are always debts, always obligations, always people who remember what you used to be." David took a sip of whiskey, and Helen could see the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. "I was supposed to take over the family operations when I turned 21. Instead, I took my trust fund and moved to Silicon Valley, built my tech company from scratch, stayed as far away from Chicago as I could get. I thought distance would be enough to keep me clean, but it wasn't," Helen said quietly, beginning to understand why Elena's visit had shaken him so completely. "Elena's family controlled territory adjacent to ours. When we were younger, there was an understanding between our families, an engagement that was supposed to unite our operations, make us stronger together." David's expression darkened. "I broke that engagement when I realized I could never love her, could never build a life with someone whose idea of problem-solving involved making people disappear." Helen felt ice form in her stomach. "And she never forgave you for that." "Elena doesn't forgive, she collects debts. For 15 years, She's been waiting for the right moment to remind me that leaving doesn't make you free. That family business has a way of following you no matter how far you run. David stood and moved to the window, staring out at the security lights that now seemed less like luxury and more like necessity. When I met Victoria, I thought I'd finally escaped for good. She was clean, pure, had no connection to any of it. We built this life, had Sophie, and I convinced myself that love was stronger than legacy. His voice broke slightly. I was wrong. The accident, Helen whispered, understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. Wasn't an accident, David confirmed, his back still to her. Victoria found something she shouldn't have. Papers I thought I'd destroyed years ago. Connections that proved I hadn't severed all ties as completely as I'd claimed. She confronted me about it the night before she died. Helen's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure David could hear it across the room. What are you saying? David turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression was so raw that Helen felt tears begin to burn behind her eyes. I'm saying that loving me killed the mother of my child, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that Elena knows this, and she's going to use it to destroy everything I've built, including you if you stay. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and possibilities that Helen wasn't sure she was brave enough to face. What does Elena want? She asked finally. My company, my property, my daughter's future, David said flatly. Everything I've worked for. Hand it over to families that will use it to expand their operations. And if I refuse, she'll make sure the authorities get very interested in investigating Victoria's death, with particular attention to the insurance money and my possible motives. Helen stood on unsteady legs, her mind racing through the implications of everything David had revealed. She'd known there were complications, but this was so much bigger than secret phone calls and mysterious visitors. David, she said carefully, are you telling me that you're still involved with organized crime? I'm telling you that I've spent 15 years trying to be free of it, but some chains are harder to break than others, David said. I'm telling you that every legitimate business I own exists because of money that was earned through illegal means 3 generations ago. I'm telling you that Elena is right about one thing. Women who love Harrington men end up paying the price for that love. Helen moved toward him, driven by an instinct stronger than fear. When she reached out to touch his face, David flinched as if her gentleness was more than he could bear. And I'm telling you, Helen said firmly, that I'm not Victoria. I'm not naive about the world, and I'm not defenseless. If Elena wants to destroy us, she's going to discover that some women fight back. David stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Helen, you don't understand what you're saying. These people don't threaten, they eliminate, they don't negotiate, they take. You could end up like Victoria. I could also end up being exactly what you and Sophie need to build a life strong enough to survive whatever Eleanor throws at you, Helen said, but only if you stop trying to protect me by pushing me away and start trusting me enough to fight beside you. Before David could respond, his phone rang with the tone he'd programmed for emergency calls. When he answered, Helen could hear the tension in Marcus's voice even from across the room. Boss, we've got a problem. Elena's people have been asking questions around town about Helen, about Sophie's school, about your security routines. Word is they're planning something for this weekend. David's expression went cold and hard, the transformation so complete that Helen barely recognized the man who'd been reading bedtime stories just hours before. Then we move up our timeline, David said. I want Helen and Sophie somewhere safe by tomorrow night, and I want Elena to understand that threatening my family was the last mistake she'll ever make. As Helen listened to David switch into a mode she'd never seen before, she realized that tomorrow would test everything they'd built together, and whether they survived would depend on whether love truly was stronger than the sins of the past. Friday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive sunshine that made evil plans seem impossible, but Helen woke with the certainty that their peaceful life was ending. David had been on the phone until almost dawn, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was coordinating something far more complex than a simple security upgrade. Sophie seemed to sense the tension, despite everyone's attempts to maintain normal routines. She picked at her breakfast, asked why Daddy looked so serious, and clung to Helen more tightly than usual when they worked in the garden. Miss Helen, Sophie said as they watered the strawberry plants that were already beginning to show tiny green shoots, are you going to go away like Mama did? The question hit Helen like a physical blow, and she knelt beside the little girl, taking her small hands in both of hers. Sophie, "Sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere," Helen said firmly. "Your daddy and I are going to make sure you're safe and happy no matter what." "Promise?" Sophie asked, her dark eyes so serious that Helen felt her heart break a little. "I promise," Helen said, meaning it completely, even though she had no idea how she would keep such a vow. "You're stuck with me, little one." That afternoon, David called Helen into his office for what he termed security briefing. The room had been transformed overnight. Additional monitors showing feeds from cameras Helen hadn't known existed, and two men she'd never seen before stood guard at positions that allowed them to watch both the house and the grounds. "Helen, these are my security specialists, James and Antonio," David said, his tone purely professional. "They'll be accompanying us to the safe house this evening." "Safe house?" Helen asked, though part of her had been expecting this development. "A property in Napa Valley, completely secure, staffed by people I trust with my life," David explained. "You and Sophie will stay there until this situation with Elena is resolved." Helen studied his face, noting the careful way he was avoiding her eyes, the controlled distance in his voice. "And where will you be?" "Handling Elena," David said simply. "Absolutely not," Helen said, surprising everyone in the room with the steel in her voice. "We're not running away while you face this alone. If we're a family, we face problems together." David's mask slipped slightly, revealing the man who was terrified of losing someone else he loved. "Helen, please, I can't lose you too. Sophie can't lose you too." "Then don't give us reasons to leave," Helen said, moving closer despite the presence of the security team. "David, if you send us away now, if you handle this without us, what kind of life are we building? One where every threat sends us into hiding while you fight our battles alone." James cleared his throat diplomatically. "Boss, if I may suggest, the lady might have a point. Elena's expecting you to isolate yourself to protect them. What if we flip the script?" David looked between Helen and his security chief, clearly torn between protective instincts and strategic thinking. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "We make it look like you're sending them away, but actually move them to the downtown penthouse. High security, but also high visibility. Elena can't make a move against them without exposing herself, and you get to keep your family close while we deal with the threat." Helen could see David weighing the options, his business mind calculating risks while his heart fought against putting them in any danger at all. "It's still a risk," he said finally. "Everything worth having is a risk," Helen replied. "The question is whether we take that risk together or separately." That evening, they implemented James's plan with precision that spoke of long experience with dangerous situations. To outside observers, David was sending Helen and Sophie away for an impromptu vacation. Suitcases were loaded into a conspicuous SUV that left through the front gate, while photographers accidentally captured images of Helen and Sophie departing. But 30 minutes later, a service van entered through the estate's rear entrance, and Helen and Sophie were quickly transported to David's downtown penthouse, a 40-story sanctuary in the sky that offered both security and strategic advantage. Sophie was delighted with the change of scenery, treating the move like an adventure rather than an escape. The penthouse had been designed for entertaining, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, but it also had security features that rivaled government buildings. "This is like living in a castle," Sophie announced, pressing her face to the windows to watch the city lights twinkle below. "Can we see our house from here?" "Not quite," David said, lifting her up to get a better view. "But we can see the ocean and the mountains and all the way to where the angels live." As Sophie chatted excitedly about their new temporary home, Helen caught David's eye over his daughter's head. The tenderness in his expression when he looked at them both made her chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for insisting on staying, for not running when things got complicated. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me stay," Helen replied. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep in the penthouse's guest room, David and Helen stood on the balcony 40 stories above the city, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them like stars. "Tomorrow, Elena's going to make her move," David said, his arms around Helen as they watched traffic flow like rivers of light below. "Whatever happens, I need you to know that these past few weeks with you and Sophie have been the happiest of my adult life." "Whatever happens," Helen said, turning in his arms to face him, "we're going to face it together. And when it's over, we're going to build something beautiful from whatever's left." David kissed her then, with everything passion, promise, desperation, and hope all tangled together in a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the building across the street or the camera that captured their embrace against the city skyline. Elena Castellanos lowered her binoculars with a smile that would have made sharks nervous. Tomorrow, she would prove to David Harrington that love was just another weakness to be exploited, and that some debts could only be paid in full destruction. Eleanor's opening move came at precisely 10 in the morning, delivered not through violence or threats, but through a perfectly dressed lawyer who appeared in the lobby of David's corporate headquarters with enough legal firepower to level a city block. Helen was having breakfast with Sophie in the penthouse when David's phone rang, his expression growing grimmer with each word of the conversation. "What is it?" Helen asked after he hung up. "Eleanor's filed a wrongful death suit against me regarding Victoria's accident," David said, his voice carefully controlled for Sophie's benefit. "She's also filed injunctions to freeze my business assets, pending a federal investigation into possible insurance fraud." Helen felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her voice level. "Can she do that? With the right judge and enough circumstantial evidence, she can tie up my resources for months," David said, "which gives her time to move on my company, my properties, and my family." Sophie looked up from her cereal with the intuitive awareness that children possessed when adults were discussing something serious. "Daddy, why do you look scared?" David immediately shifted his expression, but Helen could see the effort it cost him. "I'm not scared, Princess, just thinking about grown-up business." "Is the pretty lady from yesterday causing trouble?" Sophie asked, with startling perceptiveness. David and Helen exchanged glances, both of them amazed by how much Sophie understood, despite their attempts to shield her from adult concerns. "Sometimes people try to take things that don't belong to them," David said carefully. "But Daddy knows how to protect what matters most." After Sophie was settled with educational programs and activities in the penthouse's entertainment center, David pulled Helen into his office to show her exactly how comprehensive Elena's attack had been. "She's been planning this for months," he said, spreading legal documents across his desk. "Look at the timeline. She started building her case before she ever approached you in the garden." Helen studied the papers, noting dates and witness statements that painted a picture of David as a man with motive, means and opportunity to arrange his wife's death for financial gain. "This is all circumstantial," Helen said. "Surely no court would convict based on this." "Courts don't need to convict to destroy lives," David replied grimly. "The investigation alone will ruin my company's reputation, freeze my assets, and give Elena's people time to acquire my business interests at bargain prices. By the time I'm cleared, there won't be anything left to clear." Helen felt anger building in her chest, hot and clean and surprisingly powerful. She'd spent her life watching bullies prey on people who couldn't fight back. But Elena had made a critical error in judgment. She'd assumed that Helen would be a victim rather than a warrior. "What if we beat her to the punch?" Helen asked suddenly. "What if instead of defending against her accusations, we go on the offensive?" "What do you mean?" "I mean Elena Castellanos has been operating in the shadows for decades, using fear and intimidation to get what she wants. What happens when someone shines a light on her methods, when someone forces her to defend her own actions instead of attacking yours?" David stared at her, as if she'd suggested they declare war on gravity. "Helen, you're talking about going up against a woman who has resources and connections that span multiple states. She could have you killed before lunch and make it look like an accident." "She could try," Helen said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "But here's what Elena doesn't understand about women like me. We don't break when people try to destroy us, we get creative." Before David could respond, his secure phone rang with a call from James, who was coordinating security from a command center in the building's sub-basement. "Boss, we've got movement. Elena's people are setting up surveillance on the building. Looks like they're preparing for a long-term operation." "How long do we have?" David asked. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. But they're definitely planning something beyond legal maneuvers." After the call ended, Helen could see David weighing options that all seemed to lead to impossible choices. Surrender Sophie's future to Elena's demands, or fight a war that could cost them everything, including their lives. "There's a third option," Helen said quietly. "One that Eleanor isn't expecting because she's never encountered anyone like me before." "Which is?" Helen moved to David's computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she began researching Elena's business interests, her social connections, her public appearances over the past decade. "Eleanor spent her entire adult life building a reputation based on fear," Helen said, as information filled the screen. But reputations built on shadows can't survive in the light. What if we expose her not as a criminal, but as something worse in her world? A fraud. David leaned over her shoulder, following her research as she uncovered patterns in Elena's operations that suggested vulnerabilities no one had ever thought to exploit. You're talking about destroying her credibility within her own organization, David said slowly, making her people question whether she's strong enough to lead them. I'm talking about fighting smart instead of fighting hard, Helen said. Eleanor thinks she knows you, thinks she can predict your responses because they're based on the old David, the one who solved problems the way his grandfather did. And the new David? Helen turned in his arms, meeting his eyes with absolute certainty. The new David has something Elena will never understand. A partner who fights with her brain instead of her fists, and a daughter worth building a clean legacy for. That night, as they prepared to implement a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, Helen realized that tomorrow would determine whether love truly was stronger than hate, whether hope could triumph over revenge, and whether a woman who'd grown up fighting for everything she had could protect the family that had become her whole world. The plan unraveled at exactly 2:17 a.m. when Sophie's frightened scream shattered the silence of the penthouse. Helen and David bolted from their separate bedrooms to find Sophie's room empty, her window standing open to the night air, 40 stories above the unforgiving city below. No, David whispered, his voice breaking as he stared at the impossible evidence of his worst fear realized. No, no, no. Helen felt the world tilt sideways as she took in the scene, the carefully arranged staging that was meant to look like a tragic accident. Sophie's favorite stuffed animal, Mr. Peanuts, sat on the windowsill as if the little girl had been reaching for him when she fell. But Helen had worked with children long enough to know that Sophie would never have climbed onto a windowsill without help, and she would never have left Mr. Peanuts behind. She's not dead, Helen said with absolute certainty, her voice cutting through David's spiral of grief and rage. This is staging, David. Elena took her. David spun toward her, his eyes wild with desperation. The window's open 40 stories up, Helen. How could she? Because Elena needs leverage. Not a dead child, Helen said, moving to the window and examining the frame carefully. Look, these screens have been cut from the outside. Someone rappelled down from the roof. Even as David processed this information, his phone rang with Elena's number. Helen could hear the satisfaction in the woman's voice even from across the room. Hello, David. I trust you've discovered that your daughter has gone missing. Where is she? David's voice was barely human, stripped down to the pure essence of a father's protective fury. Safe, for now, Elena said, sleeping peacefully in a very secure location, completely unharmed. She'll stay that way as long as you follow my instructions exactly. What do you want? Everything, Eleanor said simply. Are your company, your properties, your liquid assets, all transferred to accounts I'll specify? In exchange, you get your daughter back and my promise to disappear from your lives forever. And if I refuse? Then little Sophie joins her mother in whatever afterlife you people believe in. You have 24 hours to make your choice. David, choose wisely. The line went dead, and David stood frozen, staring at the phone as if it contained the answer to an impossible equation. We're calling the police, Helen said immediately. The FBI. This is kidnapping across state lines. No, David said, his voice hollow with defeat. You don't understand what Elena's capable of. She has contacts everywhere, people in law enforcement, people in government. By the time any investigation gets started, Sophie would be dead and buried somewhere we'll never find her. Helen felt fury building in her chest, clean and bright and absolutely focused. Elena had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that taking Sophie would break David's will to fight, would force him to surrender everything he'd built to get his daughter back. What Elena hadn't counted on was that taking Sophie had also taken the one person in the world that Helen loved more than her own life. Then we don't call the authorities, Helen said, her voice carrying a strength that made David look at her with surprise. We get her back ourselves. Helen, this isn't a movie. Eleanor has professional security, multiple safe houses, resources that we can't match. We're two people against an organization. No, Helen said, moving to David's computer and beginning to access systems she'd been studying for weeks. We're two people who love Sophie more than we fear Elena, and that makes us dangerous in ways she can't predict. Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing traffic camera systems, cell phone tower records, and financial databases with skills she'd learned growing up in neighborhoods where information was survival. "Eleanor made one mistake," Helen said as data filled the screen. "She thinks like a criminal, which means she assumes everyone else thinks like a criminal. But I don't think like a criminal. I think like a mother." "What are you doing?" "Something Elena would never expect," Helen said, pulling up Elena's social media accounts, her known associates, her business transactions from the past week. "I'm thinking like a 6-year-old who's scared and missing her family." Helen studied patterns of movement, financial transactions, and communications that painted a picture of Elena's operations with startling clarity. But more importantly, she was thinking about Sophie, about what would comfort a frightened child in an unfamiliar place. "There," Helen said suddenly, pointing to a purchase order on Elena's corporate accounts. "Children's medication, specific brand that Sophie takes for her allergies. Elena's keeping her comfortable, which means she's planning to hold her for a while. That could be anywhere." "No," Helen said, cross-referencing the purchase with delivery addresses, security camera footage from surrounding businesses, and cell phone tower pings from Elena's known associates. "It's here." She pointed to a warehouse district address that matched multiple data points, a location that was isolated enough for security, but close enough for Elena to maintain control. "Helen, even if you're right, we can't just walk in there. Elena will have guards, security systems, probably backup plans if anyone tries a rescue." Helen turned to face him, her expression holding a determination that was absolutely beautiful and completely terrifying. "You're right," she said. "We can't walk in. But Eleanor's expecting David Harrington, the man who solves problems with money and power. She's not expecting Helen Richardson, the woman who raised herself on the streets and learned that sometimes the only way to beat a bully is to be smarter, faster, and more desperate than they are." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're going to get our daughter back," Helen said, emphasizing the word "our" with absolute conviction. "And then we're going to end this war once and for all." As they prepared for what might be the most important battle of their lives, neither Helen nor David noticed the emergency news bulletin flashing across every screen in the city, announcing that Elena Castellanos had just been arrested by federal agents on charges of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. But they would learn soon enough that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who had nothing left to lose. The warehouse sat like a concrete fortress against the pre-dawn darkness, but Helen approached it with the focused calm of someone who had already accepted that failure wasn't an option. David moved beside her, his usual corporate polish replaced by tactical clothing and a determination that matched her own. "Remember," Helen whispered as they reached the perimeter fence, "Elena's expecting either surrender or a frontal assault. She's not expecting parents who are willing to be smarter than they are stronger." The security system that should have been impenetrable had been compromised by Helen's research into Elena's business practices. Every organization had patterns, routines, human weaknesses that could be exploited by someone patient enough to study them. "Guard rotation changes in 43 minutes, David said, checking his watch. "We'll have a 12-minute window when the north entrance is unwatched." Helen nodded, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens, multiple vehicles moving fast through the early morning quiet. "Something's happening," she said. Something Eleanor didn't plan for. They made their way through the security perimeter with efficiency born of desperation and perfect coordination, each of them covering the other's movements as they discussed during their planning session. But as they approached the main building, it became clear that their carefully researched intelligence was already outdated. The warehouse was in chaos. Elena's security team was abandoning their posts, loading vehicles with files and equipment as if preparing for immediate evacuation. Through a window, Helen caught a glimpse of Elena herself, her usual composure replaced by frantic activity as she barked orders into multiple phones. "Federal raid," David realized. "Someone tipped off the authorities." "We have to find Sophie before they run," Helen said. But even as she spoke, she spotted movement in an upper window, a small figure that made her heart leap with relief and terror combined. Sophie stood at a second-story window, still in her pajamas, holding Mr. Peanuts and looking down at the chaos below with the confused fear of a child who didn't understand why the adults around her were acting so strangely. "There," Helen breathed, pointing to their daughter's location. "Second floor east corner room. They found the building's service entrance unlocked, Elena's people too focused on escape to maintain security protocols. Inside, the warehouse hummed with activity as computers were wiped and documents fed into industrial shredders. Helen and David made their way through corridors that smelled of fear and desperation, following the sound of Sophie's voice, calling for her daddy with increasing urgency as the activity around her intensified. They found her locked in what had clearly been intended as comfortable temporary quarters, a furnished room with toys and books that Elena had prepared to keep her small hostage content during negotiations. Sophie launched herself into David's arms with a sob of relief that broke Helen's heart. "Daddy, I knew you'd come. The scary lady said you might not, but I knew you would." "Of course I came." "Princess," David said, his voice rough with emotion as he held his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I will always come for you." "Miss Helen too?" Sophie asked, turning to Helen with arms outstretched. "Miss Helen too," Helen confirmed, gathering both of them into her arms as tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "We're a family, sweetheart. Families don't leave each other behind." "How touching." Eleanor's voice cut through their reunion like broken glass. She stood in the doorway, her usual elegance somewhat disheveled, but her eyes still holding the cold calculation that had made her dangerous for so many years. "Elena," David said, moving protectively in front of Helen and Sophie. "It's over. Let us leave." "Is it over?" Eleanor asked with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "The federal agents outside might disagree with that assessment. It seems someone has been very busy providing evidence of my business activities. I wonder who would have access to that kind of detailed information about my operations." Helen felt David tense beside her as Elena's implication became clear. Someone had indeed tipped off the federal authorities, providing them with enough evidence to shut down Elena's operations permanently. "I did," Helen said, stepping forward despite David's attempt to shield her. "I've been documenting everything since the day you first approached me in our garden. Every threat, every illegal activity, every connection to organized crime that you've been so proud of." Elena's expression shifted to something approaching respect mixed with fury. "You clever little bitch. You've been playing a longer game than I gave you credit for." "I've been protecting my family," Helen said simply, "something you'll never understand because you've never loved anything more than you love power." "Love," Elena spat. "Love is what got Victoria killed. Love is what's going to get you killed too. Some lessons are only learned through loss." Elena raised her hand, and Helen saw the gun with perfect clarity, understood that Elena had reached the point where destroying everything was preferable to losing control. But before Elena could fire, Sophie's voice cut through the tension with the pure innocence of childhood. "Miss Elena, why are you so sad?" The question was so unexpected, so completely without guile or judgment, that Elena hesitated. In that moment of confusion, David moved with the speed of a man protecting everything that mattered to him. The gun clattered across the floor as David tackled Elena, but the struggle was brief. Elena Castellanos, for all her power and connections and carefully cultivated fear, was ultimately just a woman who had built her life on the quicksand of other people's terror. "The federal agents outside will take care of her," David said, as sirens finally reached the warehouse, "and the evidence Helen gathered will ensure she spends the rest of her life paying for every family she's destroyed." 6 months later, Helen stood in the garden behind their Beverly Hills home, watching Sophie chase butterflies among the strawberry plants that were heavy with fruit. The little girl's laughter carried across the perfectly maintained lawn, bright and joyful and completely unself-conscious. "Mrs. Harrington," David said. "David," slipping his arms around her from behind and pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. "How does it feel to be married to a completely legitimate businessman?" "Feels like home," Helen said, leaning back against his chest and marveling at how much their lives had changed since Elena's arrest, and conviction had finally closed the book on David's family's criminal past. "Miss Elena was right about one thing," Sophie announced, running up to them with her hands full of strawberries. "Love is magic, but good magic, not scary magic." Helen knelt down to Sophie's level, accepting the offered strawberries with the solemnity the moment deserved. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart," Helen said. "The very best kind of magic." David joined them on the ground, and as they sat together sharing strawberries in the garden where their love story had begun, Helen reflected on how sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones built not from blood or tradition but from choice, courage, and the willingness to fight for happiness even when the odds seemed impossible. "I love you," David said quietly, his words encompassing both his wife and his daughter. "We love you too," Helen replied, speaking for both herself and Sophie, because that was what families did. They spoke with one voice when it mattered most. The little girl who had once refused to eat now devoured strawberries with enthusiasm, and the man who had carried the weight of generations of family sins now smiled with the freedom of someone who had finally learned that love was indeed stronger than legacy. And the woman who had saved them both understood that sometimes the greatest gift you could give was simply showing up and refusing to leave, even when staying required more courage than anyone should have to possess. As the sun set over their perfectly imperfect life together, the Harrington family, chosen, fought for, and built on the foundation of love that was both tender and fierce, prepared for all the beautiful tomorrows that lay ahead of them.